While in this town, the emperor remained in civilian dress, but the population was soon informed of his arrival, and the most enthusiastic demonstrations gave testimony to the affection the people had for him. The population that had gathered under his windows waited to see him in order to express to him, with the national cry of the day, Vive l'Empereur, their feelings of love and sorrow. He showed himself several times at the balcony of his apartment, and each time he was welcomed by the crowd with the same enthusiasm. He remained removed from the personnel of his retinue, who saw him no more than he had been at the Tuileries. Those near him were the Grand Marshal, the Duke of Rovigo Savary, and General Gourgaud. The emperor was calm and appeared indifferent to what was going on. In his city, the Duke of Rovigo arranged to negotiate 100,000 francs worth of drafts he had for the account of the emperor and exchanged them for gold. I had 12 deer-hide belts made in order to divide among them the 100,000 issus, 500,000 francs, in gold that constituted the treasure, which thus became easier to transport by a dozen members of the retinue. His Majesty learned in Rochefort that the provisional government had refused the furniture he had requested, and that his librarian, Monsieur Barbier, had not been able to obtain that his Trianon library be sent to him. Deputations from towns and the army came to plead with the emperor not to abandon them. The emperor replied that it was too late. His advice, opinion, and services had been scorned and rejected. The enemy was in Paris, and it would mean adding to the horrors of civil war to a foreign invasion. He could certainly, with the ex-garrison, augmented by the Rochefort troops, respond to the invitations of Generals Lamarck and Clausel, but it would be of no use for the motherland. This decision could only serve to stipulate conditions advantageous to himself, and his patriotism was too great to be concerned with his own person when so many evils were about to befall France. The emperor asked the Grand Marshal to collect the names of the army officers who made up this deputation, and those of the town deputies who likewise came to express to him their regrets and devotion. The telegraph between Rochefort and Paris was in constant contact. During the 5 days the emperor was in that city, he was being pressed to embark. The navy had not lagged behind the army in offering its services to help His Majesty elude the surveillance of the British cruisers. Captain Baudin offered his help, and Captain Besson, commanding a Danish ship, placed himself at the disposal of the emperor, promising to take him to the United States and to hide him so as to escape all searches of the cruisers. But hiding in the hold of a vessel, if it were taken, was not a method he found worthy of him. On July 8th, the emperor left Rochefort and proceeded to Ferrat to board the frigate Salle, commanded by the captain Philibert. The entire town lined his way, having but one cry for him, Vive l'Empereur! At 10 p.m., he was on board. On the 9th, he left the ship to go visit the fortifications of the island of Aix, where he was greeted with great enthusiasm by the population and the garrison. He then returned on board for lunch. On the 10th and the 11th, the emperor did not leave the frigate. He sent the Duke of Rovigo, Savary, and Count de Lacasse to find out if the safe conducts promised by the provisional government had arrived so that he could proceed to the United States. These gentlemen ascertained that they had not arrived and that the frigates would be attacked if they tried to sail out. They told the emperor that if he wished to go to England, the captain of the Bellerophon had assured them he would be welcome there. After this meeting, the British vessel came close to us and dropped anchor in the Basque roadstead. The safe conducts had not arrived, and it was obvious that they wished His Majesty to give himself up of his own accord. The household horses had just arrived in Rochefort, led by Chauvin, head of the service staff, along with a large number of male personnel. He came on board to take orders from the Grand Marshal and to request the money needed to pay the grooms and settle the expenses incurred during the trip. The means to transport such a large amount of material were lacking. The emperor was short of money, and he was told to sell them and take from the proceeds the money needed to pay the men. On the 12th, the emperor left the Salle and went to stay on the island of Aix, where various ploys were suggested to escape the British cruisers. The emperor had been greeted with enthusiasm by the population lining the shore. The dispatches from Paris invited him to depart without delay for fear of dire consequences. On the contrary, the population begged him not to leave, saying they would defend him against his enemies. King Joseph, whose attachment never failed the emperor, came on the 13th to offer to give himself up to the British, while pretending to be His Majesty, thus giving the emperor an opportunity to escape. The emperor braced him and rejected this proposal while saying goodbye and urging him to look after his own safety. Young naval officers came to propose to the Grand Marshal that the emperor go on board a coastal sloop. They were Messieurs Gentil, Duret, Potier, Sally, and Chateauneuf, and all warranted they could slip to the British cruisers without being seen by them. The emperor was touched by so much devotion, and for a moment decided to trust their courage and share their dangers, and a few personal effects were carried on board. The drawback of such a vessel was that for want of water and food, it would be forced to stop somewhere along the coast. They did not follow through with the plan, and the personal effects were unloaded. The Danish ship, with Captain Besson, offered a much better chance. Count Bertrand and the Duke of Rovigo-Savary went to visit it, and food was brought on board, along with weapons and some of the emperor's personal effects. The departure time had been settled when other decisions were reached. On the 14th, Count de Lacasse and General Lalemant were sent on board of the Bellerophon. Captain Maitland told them that he had orders to take on board Napoleon and his retinue and to treat him with the greatest courtesy. These gentlemen came back and reported to His Majesty on their mission. Captain Maitland did not guarantee that passports for American would be granted. Before that, General Lalemant had been sent to the Bordeaux River to secure passage. Much time had been wasted in Rochefort, and the delay can only be blamed on the uncertainty of the orders issued by the provisional government, the passports that were expected, the unfavorable winds, and the blockage of the exit by British vessels. Had he been alone, the emperor would not have hesitated on the choice to be made. As early as Niort, he had said, "As soon as Marchand arrives, I will go to Rochefort and board the first ship I find there sailing for America, where people can come and join me." Steered away from this solution, he came to have with him women and children, hence his hesitation. Before reaching a final decision, the emperor wished to have the advice of the people around him. He gathered them together and submitted to their deliberation whether he should surrender to the British. Several opinions were given. One of the witnesses told me that Count de Lacasse, the Duke of Rovigo-Savary, and Count Bertrand, with their loyal and generous feelings, put themselves in the place of the British ministry and thought His Majesty would be greeted in England with all the respect due adversity. The others, General Lalemant, Montalon, and Gourgaud, did not share that opinion. Less confident of British hospitality, they advised against it and begged His Majesty not to come to such a decision. General Lalemant, who had been sent to La Rochelle, said that there were in the Bordeaux River several vessels without sails that had offered their services and stated they would escape the British cruisers. All vied for the honor of saving the emperor and taking him to America. He had seen the captain of these vessels, men of resolve, and the emperor could easily reach them by land. It only required tricking the surveillance around us by pretending to be ill. To make it more believable, His Majesty only needed to leave Marchand behind to answer the questions that would be asked regarding the emperor's illness for 24 hours. He was certain he could take the emperor by land to Sens and get him on board ship before anyone became aware of his escape. This plan was disputed. The opposition won out, and the emperor returned to his room, saying to the Grand Marshal who accompanied him, "Bertrand, it's not without danger to place oneself in the hands of one's enemies, but it is better to risk trusting their honor than to fall into their hands as a rightful prisoner." The tug of war he had been subjected to for several days had ceased, and the fatal decision to turn himself over to the British had been reached. No one then foresaw St. Helena, and Count Bertrand told me that during this council meeting, General Lalemant was the only man who had opposed this decision with all of his strength. The emperor's decision to give himself up to the British had mainly been attributed to the Count and Countess Bertrand. Certainly, Countess Bertrand did not hide her desire to see the emperor go to England, and never doubted he would be received there with pomp and circumstance. It was because of her generous spirit inspired by the greater glory of the emperor. She did me the honor of talking to me about it, but such sentiments had no influence on the decision His Majesty had just reached. In St. Helena, while browsing through a small book entitled Recollections of Madame Durand, a lady on the staff of Empress Marie-Louise, the emperor read that accusation in it. He took a pencil, marked a passage, and wrote, "Untrue. I have already stated that men he could consider to be his good friends, the Duke of Vicenza, Caulaincourt, and Count de La Valette, had given him the same advice at the Élysée before leaving Paris. This advice was renewed by the older people among those he had just consulted, a large entourage which he would have had to part with had he made a different choice, perhaps contributed to the decision he reached. The emperor then wrote to the Prince Regent the following letter that shall be admired throughout the centuries and be the shame of the British government of that time. Your Royal Highness, faced with the factions that divide my country and the enmity of the greatest powers in Europe, I have ended my political career. I come like Demosthenes to sit by the hearth of the British people. I place myself under the protection of their laws, which I request from your Royal Highness, as the most powerful, the steadiness, and the most generous of my enemies. General Gourgaud, charged with taking this letter to the Prince Regent, went on board the British cruiser. He was accompanied by Count de las Casas, who informed the captain of the Bellerophon that on the next day, the 15th, the emperor would come on board. Indeed, the next morning at 6 a.m., the brig Le Pervier, flying a truce flag, took the emperor on board and conveyed him to Bellerophon. The deepest sadness showed on every face when the British gig approached to take the emperor on board. The most heart-rending cries were heard. Officers and sailors saw with despair His Majesty trust his fate to the generosity of a nation whose perfidy they knew well. Having said goodbye to the crew and cast a final look on this beautiful France, whose destiny he was abdicating, the emperor climbed into the gig. Cries of Vive l'Empereur mixed with sobs accompanied him until he arrived on board the Bellerophon. Despair was so great among some that they pulled their hair out, while others trampled their hats with their feet out of rage. It is regrettable that the emperor did not board the Méduse rather than the Saule. The two captains did not have the same amount of vigor. The latter was a cold man who perhaps had orders to attempt nothing to save the emperor. He had kept the fleur-de-lis on the paints that separated the dining rooms from the salons, which could attest to his small measure of Bonapartism. The captain of the Méduse, on the other hand, was bursting with it. To save the emperor or to die was his motto, and he envisaged that possibility by attacking to Bellerophon with both frigates while Le Pervier got through. That act of devotion was still possible on the day he went on board, but the next day, the presence of Admiral Hotham made it impossible. Learning of the emperor's decision to surrender to the British, good Captain Ponnet cried, "Ah! Why did he not come on board my ship rather than the Saule? I would have gotten him through in spite of the cruisers. In what hands is he placing himself? Who could have given him such vicious advice? That nation is nothing but perfidy. Poor Napoleon, you are lost. A terrible premonition tells me so." When the emperor left Le Pervier, General Becker went up to the emperor and asked if he should accompany him to the Bellerophon. The emperor said to him, "Do nothing of the kind. They would certainly say that you gave me up to the British." The general seized the hand of the emperor offered him, covered it with kisses, and rising with his eyes full of tears said, "Sire, may you be happier than we." Note, General Becker has said, and Monsieur de Volabeille has repeated, that while sleeping on board near the emperor, separated from him only by a thin partition, during the night he had heard cries brought about by an attack of hemorrhoids that had tormented him at Waterloo. The general was mistaken, for neither in Elba, nor during the 100 Days, nor in St. Helena did the emperor ever complain of such a problem.